The sound of the Pacific is never truly silent. It is a rhythmic, heavy pulse that speaks of distances we can barely imagine. On the eastern shore of the island of Pohnpei, the water moves with a particular, weighted grace, filtering through a labyrinth of mangroves and shallow reefs. Here, the air is thick with the scent of salt spray and damp earth, a humid veil that seems to hold the heat of the day long after the light has begun to fade. If one were to stand at the edge of the lagoon and look out toward the horizon, the view would be interrupted by something that feels fundamentally out of place. A series of dark, geometric shadows rising directly from the turquoise shallows. These are not natural formations of coral or rock, but the skeletal remains of an architectural feat so immense that it defies the logic of the ancient world. They are the walls of Nan Madol, 92 man-made islets constructed entirely of massive basalt columns stacked like cordwood across the surface of the reef. To look upon these structures is to confront the weight of deep time and the realization that our understanding of human capability is often limited by the horizons of our own era. Each of these islets was built by transporting thousands of tons of volcanic rock across the island, yet there are no records of wheels, no pulleys, and no beasts of burden to explain how such a feat was achieved. The columns are prismatic, naturally formed into six-sided shapes by the slow cooling of ancient lava, but moved here by hands that have been dust for 1,000 years. They rise from the water in high, defensive walls, some reaching 30 feet into the air, creating a network of canals that has earned this place the title of the Venice of the Pacific. But unlike the bustling canals of Italy, the waterways of Nan Madol are eerily still. The tides ebb and flow through the narrow passages, carrying the occasional leaf or drift of silt, but for the most part, the city remains a silent witness to a civilization that vanished as mysteriously as it arrived. As you settle into your blankets and let the rhythm of the waves fill your mind, you might find yourself drifting alongside the shadows of these great walls. It is a peaceful place to wander in thought, and if you are finding comfort in these stories of the distant past, you are exactly where you belong. Here at the Slumber Archives, we gather every evening to explore the forgotten corners of our world, sharing new history narrations every single day to help you find rest. If you enjoy these journeys into the unknown, perhaps you might consider subscribing so that we can meet here again tomorrow night. And a simple like on this video helps our quiet stories reach others who are also seeking a moment of calm. For the local people of Pohnpei, the silence of Nan Madol is not merely a lack of noise, it is a presence. Even today, many are reluctant to visit the ruins after the sun has dipped below the trees, and almost no one would dare to spend a night among the basalt pillars. There is a deeply held belief that the city is still inhabited by the spirits of the Saudeleur, the powerful and often feared dynasty that ruled this region for centuries. The air between the stones feels heavy with the accumulation of secrets, as if the very walls are holding their breath, waiting for a king who will never return. In the world of archaeology, we often look for stratigraphy, the layers of soil and debris that tell the story of a site's occupation over hundreds or thousands of years, but at Nan Madol, the story is written in the stone itself, and in the sheer, staggering scale of the labor required to lift it from the sea. The city covers nearly 11 square miles of the lagoon, a sprawling complex of residential areas, mortuary temples, and ritual pools. It is a triumph of engineering that predates many of the great cathedrals of Europe, yet it was built on the edge of a remote volcanic island in the middle of the world's largest ocean. When we speak of the Younger Dryas, that cold, turbulent period, nearly 12,800 years ago that reshaped the face of the earth, we are reminded that civilizations are fragile things, easily erased by the passage of millennia. While Nan Madol is not that old, its origins are shrouded in a similar fog of uncertainty. Radiocarbon dating, a method used to determine the age of organic materials by measuring the decay of carbon isotopes, suggests that the earliest construction may have begun around the 8th or 9th century. However, the oral traditions of the island speak of a much deeper history, one that stretches back to a time when two brothers arrived from a distant land, using magic to levitate the great stones into place. We are left to wonder at the limits of what we truly know. Is it possible that the ruins we see today are merely the final iteration of a sacred site that had been used for much longer? As the tide rises, the water creeps up the sides of the basalt columns, submerging the lower layers and turning the canals into a mirror for the stars. The city becomes a ghost of itself, reflecting a sky that has watched the rise and fall of countless empires. There is no one left to rule Nan Madol, no one to walk the high platforms or offer sacrifices in the central temple of Nandawas. There is only the wind, the water, and the enduring mystery of a people who built a city on the waves, seemingly for the sole purpose of proving that they could. The scale of the site is difficult to grasp until one considers that the total weight of the basalt used is estimated at 750,000 metric tons. To move such a volume of stone without modern machinery is a task that suggests a level of social organization and devotion that is almost alien to our modern sensibilities. It was a city of the elite, a place where the rulers could separate themselves from the commoners on the main island, surrounded by the protective embrace of the ocean. But the ocean is a patient neighbor, and over the centuries it has begun to reclaim what was taken from it. Mangroves twist their roots through the gaps in the stones, and the salt air slowly eats away at the volcanic rock. And yet, the city stands. It remains a monument to the forgotten, a place where the past is not a memory, but a physical weight that anchors the island of Pohnpei to the deep history of the Pacific. As we begin our journey through the corridors of this silent city, let the weight of these stones ground you, and let the slow pulse of the lagoon carry you toward a deeper, more ancient kind of rest. Deep beneath the surface of the Pacific, where the light begins to fail and the pressure of the ocean becomes a constant, heavy embrace, the earth once tore itself open. Millions of years ago, a hot spot in the mantle began to bleed molten rock into the freezing depths, layer upon layer of basalt, cooling into stone until it finally broke the surface of the waves. This was the birth of Pohnpei, a solitary emerald rising out of a blue desert. As the volcanic fires cooled, the winds and the currents brought life in small, persistent increments. Seeds drifted on the air, birds found rest on the jagged black cliffs, and eventually the harsh volcanic slopes were softened by a thick velvet shroud of rainforest. To look at Pohnpei from above is to see a world defined by the color green, a green so deep and vibrant that it seems to pulse with its own internal light. The island is one of the wettest places on our planet, where the clouds snag on the high mountain peaks and pour down an endless supply of fresh water. This water carves deep ravines and feeds hidden waterfalls, eventually slowing its pace as it reaches the coastal mangroves and the protective ring of the coral reef. Long before the first stone of Nan Madol was ever moved, the island was already a masterpiece of natural engineering, a self-sustaining refuge in the middle of a vast, unforgiving wilderness of salt water. We must imagine the first humans who saw this place. They were the great navigators of the Austronesian expansion, people who viewed the horizon not as a boundary, but as a doorway. They moved across the Pacific in double-hulled canoes, guided by the patterns of the stars, the temperature of the water, and the flight paths of migratory birds. When they finally sighted the high peaks of Pohnpei, perhaps 2,000 years ago, they found an island that offered everything a seafaring culture could desire. The reef was a garden of protein, teeming with fish and mollusks,
while the volcanic soil was rich enough to support the staples of their life, the taro, the yam, and the breadfruit. These early settlers did not immediately build monuments. They lived in harmony with the natural contours of the land, establishing small, scattered communities along the coast and within the fertile valleys. Theirs was a society of the shore and the soil, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the tides and the seasonal harvest. They were a people of wood and fibre, leaving behind little for the modern archaeologist to find. We look for their presence in the subtle shifts of the earth, in the layers of discarded shells and the microscopic traces of pollen that tell us when the first forests were cleared for gardens. This is what we call stratigraphy, the study of the layers of time, where each centimetre of soil represents a generation of breath and labour. As the centuries drifted by, these early Pohnpeians developed a complex understanding of their environment. They learned which basalt flows yielded the strongest stone for tools, and which plants held the secrets of healing. They were not a primitive people, but a highly specialized one, perfectly adapted to the constraints and the bounties of a high volcanic island. They built their homes on raised platforms of earth and stone, tucked away from the salt spray, and they looked out at the lagoon as a source of life, never imagining that one day the lagoon itself would be paved over with a city of stone. In these quiet, early years, the social structure was likely decentralized, a collection of independent chiefdoms or family groups, each tending to their own slice of the paradise they had discovered. There was no single king, no grand design, and no hint of the monumental labor that was to come. And yet, the seeds of the future were already being sown in the way they organized their labor and their spirituality. They brought with them a deep reverence for the ancestors and a belief in the spiritual power of the land, a power they called Manaman. It was a force that resided in the mountains, the streams, and the very bones of the island. The transition from these humble beginnings to the rise of a great dynasty remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the Pacific. We have used radiocarbon dating,
a process that measures the decay of carbon isotopes to tell us how long ago an organic material lived, to pin down the arrival of these first explorers to roughly the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. For nearly 1,000 years, they lived in this state of equilibrium, their population growing slowly, their culture deepening like the roots of the ancient banyan trees that began to claim the inland slopes. But history is rarely a straight line of peaceful progress. Deep time has a way of hiding the fractures and the shifts that change the course of a civilization. Somewhere around the 11th or 12th century, the atmosphere of Pohnpei began to change. The oral traditions of the island speak of two brothers, Olosohpa and Olosihpa, who arrived from a distant land, possessing a knowledge of magic and architecture that the locals had never seen. Whether these brothers were literal figures or metaphors for a new wave of migration and conquest, their arrival marked the end of the early period and the birth of the Saudeleur dynasty. As we consider these early Pohnpeians, we must feel the weight of the centuries they spent in quietude. They watched the sun rise and set over the same lagoon for a millennium before the first massive basalt log was ever quarried. They knew the island in a way that we can never truly replicate. Every bird call, every shift in the wind, every secret path through the mangroves was a part of their living map. They were the foundation upon which the great city was built, the hands that first tilled the soil and the voices that first sang to the spirits of the reef. Imagine the stillness of those early evenings, the smoke from small cooking fires drifting upward through the canopy, the sound of the waves breaking on the distant reef, and the feeling of being utterly alone in the center of a blue world. There was no iron here, no pottery, and no writing as we understand it. Their history was held in the memory of the elders and the chants of the priests, a fragile thread of continuity that stretched back across the waves to the ancestral homelands. It was a world of profound simplicity and terrifying vulnerability, where a single storm or a failed harvest could mean the end of a lineage. And so the stage was set. The island was populated, the resources were understood, and the spiritual map of the land was drawn. The early Pohnpeians had survived the crossing of the vast Pacific and had carved a life out of the volcanic rock. They had become a part of the island, and the island had become a part of them. But the long silence of the early centuries was about to be broken by the sound of stone striking stone, and the peaceful lagoon was about to be transformed into a seat of power that would dominate the region for hundreds of years. As the years passed, the small-scale settlements began to coalesce. The influence of the newcomers grew, and the labor of the people began to be directed toward a single, monumental goal. The rise of the Saudeleur was not just a political shift, but a spiritual one, a reorganization of the very world they inhabited. They would no longer live merely on the land. They would build upon the water. They would challenge the sea itself, creating an artificial archipelago that would serve as both a palace and a tomb, a place where the line between the human and the divine would be blurred by the sheer scale of the architecture. But before we reach the height of the dynasty, let us linger for a moment longer in that earlier, quieter Pohnpei. Let us appreciate the patience of the first settlers, the slow accumulation of knowledge, and the deep roots they sank into the volcanic soil. It is in this quiet foundation that the true strength of the island lies, a strength that would be needed to sustain the weight of the millions of tons of stone that were soon to be moved. The story of Nan Madol is not just a story of kings and ghosts, but a story of the earth and the sea, and the people who found a way to bridge the two. A faint, rhythmic chanting seems to echo through the corridors of time, a sound carried on the warm trade winds that have brushed against these shores for thousands of years. It is a melody of the deep past, whispering of a moment when the mundane world collided with something far more ancient and formidable. The oral traditions of Pohnpei, preserved with a reverence that matches the permanence of the stone itself, tell of a day when the horizon changed. Two brothers, Olosohpa and Olosihpa, appeared upon the waves, arriving from a mythical land to the west known as Katao. They did not come as conquerors in the traditional sense, with fleets of warships or armies of men, but as sorcerers, practitioners of a profound and forgotten magic that allowed them to navigate the spiritual currents of the world as easily as a sailor navigates the tides. They were tall, imposing figures, carrying with them a sacred burden, the command to establish a place of worship that would bridge the gap between the mortal realm and the divine. As they stepped onto the lush green fringes of Pohnpei, they began a long and wearying search for the perfect location to build an altar to Sap, the god of the earth. This was not a task to be rushed. They travelled the circumference of the island, testing the spiritual resonance of the soil and the water. At several locations, they attempted to begin their work, but the foundations would not hold. The spirits of those places were restless, or perhaps the land itself was not yet ready to receive the weight of their ambition. They looked for a sign, a convergence of natural forces that would signal the center of the world. Eventually, the brothers climbed to the summit of a high peak, looking down upon the eastern coastline. From this vantage point, they saw a reef-fringed lagoon near the island of Temwen, where the water turned a specific luminous shade of turquoise, and the waves broke against the coral in a pattern that spoke of hidden symmetries. It was there, amidst the shallow flats and the mangrove roots, that they saw their vision realized. They saw a city rising not from the solid earth, but from the sea itself, a labyrinth of stone that would defy the very elements. The construction of Nan Madol, in the eyes of the modern observer, presents a staggering engineering challenge. We speak of thousands of megalithic basalt columns, some weighing as much as 50 tons, transported from quarries on the opposite side of the island. In the language of archaeology, we might discuss the use of levers, the buoyancy of rafts, or the sheer force of thousands of laborers working in unison over centuries. But the legends offer a different perspective, one that invites us to step away from the rigid constraints of physics and into a world of wonder. It is said that Olosohpa and Olosihpa did not need the straining muscles of men to move the great stones. Instead, they stood upon the shore and reached out with their inner sight, tapping into a power that resides in the vibration of the earth. With a low, resonant hum, they commanded the basalt logs to rise. The massive stones, shaped like natural prisms by the cooling of ancient lava, lifted from the ground as if they were as light as the pith of a palm tree. They drifted through the air, gliding over the dense jungle canopy and the jagged hills, guided by the will of the sorcerers. One by one, the stones lowered themselves into the water, stacking with impossible precision to form the foundations of the 92 artificial islets. This image of levitation is a recurring theme in the stories of lost civilizations across the globe, from the high Andes to the sands of Giza, suggesting a universal human intuition that there was once a way to interact with the physical world that we have since forgotten. Whether this represents a poetic memory of advanced mechanical techniques or a literal description of a lost science of acoustics and vibration, the result remains the same. A city that feels as though it were breathed into existence rather than built. The brothers worked in silence, the only sound being the rhythmic clinking of stone upon stone and the soft lap of the tide against the rising walls. As the first structures took shape, the spiritual authority of the brothers became undeniable. They were no longer mere travelers. They were the architects of a new era. During the construction, Olosihpa passed away, leaving his brother to complete the sacred work alone. Olosohpa then became the first Saudeleur, a title that translates to Lord of Deleur. This marked the founding of the Saudeleur Dynasty, a line of rulers who would govern Pohnpei for many centuries. The rise of the Saudeleur was not merely a political shift, but a divine mandate. They were seen as the living representatives of the gods, and Nan Madol became the seat of their power. A private floating sanctuary where the elite lived in isolation from the common people of the main island. The city was designed to reinforce this separation. The high walls of the royal mortuary, Nan Madol, rose like a mountain from the water, its basalt pillars stacked in a header and stretcher pattern that created a sense of impenetrable strength. To live within Nan Madol was to live in a state of constant ritual. The Saudeleur oversaw the ceremonies that ensured the fertility of the land and the abundance of the sea. They kept a sacred eel in a specialized well, feeding it the entrails of sea turtles to appease the spirits. The city functioned as a massive stone-carved clock, its canals and courtyards aligned with the movements of the stars and the cycles of the moon. In this quiet, watery world, time moved differently. The heavy basalt absorbed the heat of the day and released it slowly through the night, creating a constant ambient warmth that seemed to emanate from the bones of the earth itself. As the generations passed, the dynasty grew more powerful, and the demands they placed on the population grew more heavy. The transition from the era of the sorcerers to the era of the kings was marked by a shift in the atmosphere of the city. What began as a project of spiritual devotion gradually transformed into a system of absolute control. The people of Pohnpei were required to bring tributes of food and water to the city, navigating their canoes through the narrow channels to deliver the fruits of their labor to the lords who lived among the stones. Yet even as the shadow of the Saudeleur lengthened over the island, the mystery of the city's origin remained. The basalt columns, some over 20 feet long, stood as silent witnesses to the power of the founding brothers. When we look at the sheer scale of the construction, we are forced to reckon with the limits of our understanding. Radiocarbon dating of the earliest layers suggests that the major phases of construction began around the 12th century, but the legends hint at a much deeper history, a foundation laid in a time before the counting of years began. In the stillness of the lagoon, where the shadows of the ruins stretch across the sandy floor, one can almost feel the presence of Olosohpa watching over his creation. The city he built was intended to last forever, a permanent bridge between the seen and the unseen. It was a place where the weight of the stone was balanced by the lightness of the spirit, and where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was as thin as the mist that clings to the mountains in the early morning. And so, the Saudeleur dynasty began its long reign, anchored by the magic of the twins and the enduring strength of the basalt, a reign that would eventually face its own silent end, leaving behind only the ghosts and the stones to tell the story. The sound of the Pacific here is not a roar, but a rhythmic, liquid pulse, the sound of salt water pressing against stone that was never meant to be there. To understand Nan Madol, one must first understand the stone itself, for it is the very bone and marrow of this place. If you were to glide through the shallow lagoons of Pohnpei today, your eyes would eventually find something that defies the logic of the natural world. Rising out of the turquoise shallows are thousands upon thousands of dark hexagonal prisms, heavy volcanic logs of basalt that look as though they were carved by a giant's chisel. These are not bricks, nor are they the crumbled remains of a mountain. They are columnar basalt, a geological phenomenon born from the slow, patient cooling of molten lava. As the Earth's heat bled away into the atmosphere eons ago, the cooling rock contracted, cracking into these perfect geometric pillars. The builders of the city did not find these stones on the reef. They found them on the far side of the island, at sites like Yu and Madolenimu, where the volcanic cliffs stand like frozen cathedrals. The sheer scale of the labor involved is enough to make the modern mind feel a sense of heavy, weary awe. Each of these basalt logs can weigh anywhere from 5 to 50 tons. There are no pulleys here, no iron tools and no wheels. Yet the ancient Pohnpeians moved tens of thousands of these stones across the island and over the water. Local legend whispers that the twin sorcerers used their magic to make the stones fly, hovering through the air like dragonflies before settling into place. Archaeology, in its more grounded but no less impressive pursuit, suggests a mastery of the tides, perhaps using great bamboo rafts that rose with the incoming sea, carrying the weight of the basalt until it could be slid onto the growing foundations of the islets. As you drift further into the heart of the complex, the layout begins to reveal itself, stretching across 92 artificial islands. This is not a city built upon land, but a city that reclaimed the sea. The foundations were laid directly onto the coral reef flats, a feat of engineering that required an intimate knowledge of the ocean's moods. The builders first constructed outer walls of stacked basalt, creating a perimeter that could withstand the constant erosion of the tides. Inside these walls, they poured tons of coral rubble, filling the gaps until a solid, level platform rose just above the high water mark. It is a process of stratigraphy in reverse. Instead of digging down into the earth to find the past, we look at how they built upward from the seabed to create a future. The city is divided into 2 distinct sectors, separated by a central canal that acts as a silent, watery highway. To the southwest lies Olosohpa, the lower city, which served as the administrative and residential heart, where the elite lived in houses of wood and thatch atop their stone pedestals. To the northeast is Madolpao, the upper city, a more somber and sacred realm dedicated to the mortuary arts and the worship of the high gods. Within this labyrinth, the engineering serves a dual purpose. The walls are not merely for defense or status, they are designed to breathe. The gaps between the stacked basalt logs allow the cooling trade winds to pass through the structures, creating a natural form of air conditioning that must have made the tropical heat bearable for the high priests and the royalty. The canals themselves are the lifeblood of Nan Madol. They are wide and shallow, designed to be navigated by outrigger canoes that moved silently between the islets. Even today, as the tide recedes, the water remains in these channels, reflecting the dark stone and the green canopy above. These waterways were more than just roads. They were a way of organizing society. Certain canals were reserved for the passage of the Saudeleur servants, carrying food and fresh water from the mainland, while others were sacred paths where only the most high-ranking priests could travel. The water acted as a buffer, a soft barrier that kept the common world at a distance from the divine presence of the rulers. One cannot help but wonder about the precision required to align these 92 islands so perfectly. Despite the passage of 1,000 years and the relentless growth of the mangroves that now claw at the foundations, the city remains remarkably stable. The basalt logs are stacked in an alternating pattern, one layer running lengthwise, the next crosswise, in a technique known as header and stretcher masonry. This creates a lattice work of immense strength, a stone weave that has survived countless typhoons and the slow rise of the ocean levels. It is a testament to a people who did not see the reef as a void, but as a canvas. As the sun moves across the sky, the shadows of the basalt pillars lengthen across the water, and the city seems to shift and change. The dark rock absorbs the heat of the day, radiating a gentle warmth long after the light has faded. There is a profound stillness here, a quality of silence that is unique to ruins that have been reclaimed by the wild. You can almost hear the echoes of the past in the lap of the waves, the sound of a stone being eased into place, the splash of a paddle, the low chant of a priest in the mortuary temple. The engineering of Nan Madol was not just about moving weight. It was about creating a space where the heavy reality of the earth could meet the fluid mystery of the sea. The sheer volume of basalt used in the construction is estimated to be over 750,000 metric tons. To put that in perspective, it is a mass of stone that rivals the Great Pyramids of Egypt, yet it was moved and stacked by a population that likely numbered only a few thousand at any given time. This suggests a society of incredible focus and social cohesion, or perhaps a society under the thumb of a dynasty so powerful that their will could command the very bones of the island to move. As we look closer at the individual islands, we see that each had a specific function. Some were for the preparation of food, some for the building of canoes, and others for the secret rituals of the dead. It was a complete ecosystem, a specialized world where every stone had a name and every canal had a purpose. And yet, for all its structural brilliance, Nan Madol remains a place of deep shadows. The more we learn about the way the basalt was quarried and the foundations were laid, the more we realize how much has been lost to time. We can measure the stones, we can map the canals, and we can use radiocarbon dating to tell us that the major construction began around the 12th century. But we cannot truly know the minds of the architects. We see the how, but the why remains draped in the mist. Why build here on a reef, miles away from fresh water and fertile soil? Why commit centuries of labor to a city that required constant maintenance against the salt and the tide? Perhaps it was the very difficulty of the task that gave the city its power. To rule from a place that should not exist is to prove that you are more than human. As the water continues its slow dance through the canals, the basalt stands as a silent witness to the passage of ages. The logs, once molten and flowing, are now fixed in a permanent, geometric embrace, holding back the sea and the forest alike. It is a place where the engineering of man and the geology of the earth have become one, a monument to a civilization that understood the weight of stones and the power of the water that surrounds them. in the quiet of the afternoon, when the wind dies down and the lagoon becomes a mirror, Nan Madol looks less like a ruin and more like a sleeping giant, waiting for the tide to turn once again. The scent of damp earth and salt spray hangs heavy in the air, a constant reminder that here, on the edge of Pohnpei, the boundaries between the solid world and the liquid abyss are perpetually blurred. To understand Nan Madol is to understand the weight of a gaze, the unblinking, absolute authority of the Saudeleur dynasty that once watched over these canals from their basalt thrones. As the years passed, the city became more than a marvel of engineering. It transformed into a grand stage for a social order as rigid and unyielding as the stones themselves. The island was no longer a collection of scattered tribes, but a singular machine, fueled by the labor and the breath of thousands, all directed toward the silent, shimmering islets of the elite. In this era, Pohnpei was divided by an invisible geography of status. While the commoners lived on the main island, their lives tethered to the rhythmic cycles of planting yams and harvesting breadfruit, the ruling class inhabited a separate reality. They resided upon the artificial islands, suspended above the water, physically detached from the soil that fed them. This physical separation was the ultimate expression of the Saudeleur's power. To live on the water was to be closer to the gods and further from the mundane concerns of the earth. The commoners looked across the lagoon toward the rising smoke of the city's hearths, knowing that their existence was justified only by their service to the lords of the stone. The social hierarchy was absolute, a pyramid of human souls with the Saudeleur at the apex, claiming divine descent. Beneath them were the high priests and the noble families, each allocated specific islets according to their function and their favor. Daily life for these elites was a choreographed ritual of leisure and spiritual observance, facilitated by a constant stream of tribute flowing inward from the surrounding districts. The city acted as a great vacuum, drawing in the resources of the entire island. Every basket of fish, every bundle of taro, and every crafted tool was funneled through the canals of Nan Madol. It was a centralized system of control that allowed the rulers to maintain their grip without ever having to set foot on the common ground of the mainland. Imagine the quiet progress of a tribute canoe as it glides through the narrow waterways in the early morning mist. The paddlers, commoners who have travelled from the far reaches of the island, move with a practiced, hushed reverence. They carry the finest yields of the season, the largest yams, the sweetest fruits, the most vibrant feathers. As they pass between the towering walls of basalt, the sheer scale of the architecture serves as a silent intimidation. The stones, stacked in their strange interlocking patterns, whisper of a power that can command the very bones of the earth. To enter Nan Madol was to enter a space where the laws of nature felt secondary to the laws of the dynasty. This centralization was not merely about wealth, it was about the total management of the human spirit. By requiring the local chiefs and potential rivals to reside within the city for long periods, the Saudeleur practiced a form of political hostage-taking disguised as honor. Under the watchful eyes of the sovereign, these sub-chiefs were stripped of their autonomy. Their focus shifted from their own lands to the intricate courtly intrigues of the islets. The city was a golden cage, a place of luxury and ceremony that simultaneously functioned as a panopticon, a structure where everyone was visible and no dissent could go unnoticed. The religious life of the city was equally suffocating in its precision. Nan Madol was the spiritual heart of the island, the place where the veil between the living and the ancestors was thinnest. The Saudeleur positioned themselves as the sole intermediaries between these worlds, using elaborate ceremonies to reinforce their legitimacy. Sacred eels were kept in special pools, fed the entrails of sacrificed turtles in rituals that were as much about public display as they were about piety. The commoners were excluded from these inner sanctums, allowed only to witness the distant echoes of chanting and the flickering light of ceremonial fires reflecting off the dark water. They were told that the prosperity of the tides and the fertility of the soil depended entirely on the continued satisfaction of the rulers and their gods. As the centuries rolled on, the burden of this tribute began to weigh more heavily than the basalt blocks themselves. The demands of the Saudeleur grew increasingly erratic and cruel, reflecting a dynasty that had become disconnected from the reality of the people it ruled. Legends speak of rulers who demanded the impossible, who saw the island not as a community, but as a resource to be exhausted. The atmosphere within the city grew heavy with the tension of a society stretched to its breaking point. The very stones seemed to absorb the resentment of the labourers who had hauled them, and the silence of the canals began to feel less like peace and more like a held breath. Archaeology, through the lens of stratigraphy, the study of the layers of earth and debris deposited over time, reveals the shift in how the city was used. In the lower, older layers, we find evidence of a more balanced existence. But as we move upward into the height of the Saudeleur period, the artifacts tell a story of extreme specialization and concentrated waste. The elite were consuming the best of everything, leaving behind the remnants of feasts that the commoners could only dream of. The radiocarbon dating of these layers, a process that measures the decay of carbon isotopes to pin down a specific moment in history, confirms that this period of intense centralization lasted for several hundred years, a long, slow burn of absolute authority. Yet for all their power, the Saudeleur lived in a state of perpetual anxiety. The sea, while their protector, was also a gateway for potential threats. The city was designed with defense in mind, its walls thick and its entrances narrow, but the true danger lay in the hearts of the people on the mainland. The rigid hierarchy created a fragile stability. It was a structure that could stand for an eternity if left undisturbed, but one that lacked the flexibility to survive a true shock to the system. The rulers sat in their basalt chambers, surrounded by the spoils of a whole island, listening to the water lap against the foundations, perhaps wondering if the next tide would bring tribute or something far more dangerous. In the quiet hours of the night, when the moon casts long, distorted shadows across the canals, one can almost feel the presence of that ancient tension. The city remains a testament to the ambition of those who wished to transcend their human limitations, to build a world that was immune to the passage of time and the whims of the common man. But the stones also tell a story of the cost of such ambition, the exhaustion of the land, the silencing of the people, and the eventual, inevitable collapse of a system that forgot its roots in the soil. The Saudeleur dynasty, for all its magnificence, was ultimately a prisoner of the very walls it constructed, trapped in a cycle of control that could only end in silence. And so, the Venice of the Pacific stood as a monument to the human desire for order in a chaotic world. It was a place where every movement was calculated, every resource accounted for, and every soul assigned its place in the grand design. But as the wind sighs through the mangroves and the water continues its patient work of erosion, we are reminded that no hierarchy is permanent, and no city, no matter how heavy its stones, can truly hold back the changing tides of history. The mystery of Nan Madol lies not just in how it was built, but in how it was lived, a delicate, dangerous dance of power played out on a stage of basalt and brine under the watchful, silent eyes of the Pacific. Deep beneath the surface of the dark, brackish canals, where the light of the sun struggles to penetrate the density of the silt and the shadows of the basalt columns, there lives a creature that has haunted the Pohnpeian imagination for 1,000 years. It is the saltwater eel, a sleek and muscular phantom of the reef, moving with a fluid grace that seems to defy the rigid architecture of the city above. In Nan Madol, the eel was never merely an animal. It was a vessel, a living bridge between the world of men and the silent, crushing depths of the divine. The air here smells of salt and ancient dampness, a scent that carries the weight of centuries-old rituals performed in the flickering light of torches. To the Saudeleur lords, the eel was the earthly manifestation of Nan Sapwe, the supreme deity of the storm and the sky. This connection created a profound spiritual paradox. The god of the heavens resided within a creature of the mud and the dark water. To maintain the favor of the heavens, one had to appease the shadows below. As the years passed, this belief coalesced into a series of rituals so precise and so atmospheric that they transformed the city into a living cathedral of stone. At the heart of this spiritual geography lay the islet of Pohnpei. This was not a place for the common people, nor even for the lesser nobility. It was a sacred sanctuary, a quiet walled enclosure where the high priests, the keepers of the secret names and the ancient songs would gather to commune with the sacred eel. Imagine, if you will, the scene as it might have appeared during the height of the Saudeleur's reign. The water is still, reflecting the massive stone walls like a mirror of black glass. A procession of priests moves slowly along the narrow walkways, their footsteps muffled by the humidity. They carry with them a specific offering, the cooked entrails of a turtle, a creature that held its own deep significance in the Pohnpeian cosmos. The priests would approach the water's edge and begin a low, rhythmic chant, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the islet. This was the calling. They would wait, the smoke from small ceremonial fires curling into the heavy air until a ripple appeared on the surface of the canal. Out of the darkness, the great eel would emerge, its eyes catching the torchlight, its body thick and powerful. The feeding of the eel was a moment of terrifying intimacy. It was the physical manifestation of the contract between the rulers and the gods. As the priest offered the meat, he was not just feeding an animal. He was nourishing the stability of the entire kingdom. If the eel accepted the offering with ease, it was a sign of divine favor. The rains would come, the taro would grow, and the Saudeleur's grip on the islands would remain unchallenged. But if the creature retreated into the depths, or if it showed signs of agitation, a cold dread would settle over the city. A refused offering was a harbinger of drought, of sickness, or perhaps something worse, the withdrawal of the god's protection. This spiritual theatre was essential to the maintenance of power. In a world where the environment was unpredictable and the ocean could be both a provider and a destroyer, the Saudeleur positioned themselves as the only intermediaries capable of calming the chaos. They were the masters of the eel, and by extension, the masters of the fate of every soul on Pohnpei. The religion of Nan Madol was not a separate entity from its politics. They were woven together like the fibers of a coconut husk rope, each strengthening the other until they were inseparable. The islet of Pohnpei served as the silent engine of this control. By restricting access to these rituals, the high priests created an aura of impenetrable mystery. The commoners, laboring in the distant fields or fishing on the outer reefs, knew only that the great ceremonies were taking place. They saw the smoke rising from the sacred islets and heard the faint, ghostly echoes of the chants drifting over the water. This distance bred a profound sense of awe and fear. To question the Saudeleur was not merely an act of rebellion against a king. It was an act of sacrilege against the very forces that held the world together. Meanwhile, the architecture of the islets themselves reinforced this spiritual hierarchy. The high walls and narrow entrances were designed to control the flow of both people and information. Only those of the highest rank were permitted to witness the sacred eel, ensuring that the truth of the divine remained a private commodity of the ruling class. This use of sacred space is a pattern we see across many lost civilizations, from the high temples of the Maya to the inner sanctums of the Egyptian pharaohs, a way of using the physical environment to mirror the invisible structures of heaven and earth. As we reflect on these rituals, we must consider the sheer endurance of the belief. For hundreds of years, the cycle of feeding and chanting continued, a heartbeat of tradition that survived the rise and fall of individual rulers. The eel remained in the water, a silent witness to the passage of generations. It saw the stones being hauled into place, and it saw the first cracks begin to form in the Saudeleur's authority. There is a certain melancholy in the thought of those priests standing on the edge of Pohnpei, looking down into the dark water and searching for a sign. They were men who lived in a world where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was paper-thin. To them, the movement of a fin or the tilt of an eel's head was a language more important than any spoken word. They were reading the intentions of the universe in the ripples of a canal. But religion, while a powerful tool for unity, can also become a heavy burden. The demands of the gods and the priests who spoke for them grew more exacting over time. The rituals required more resources, more labor, and more sacrifice. The delicate balance between the rulers and the ruled began to fray as the spiritual needs of Nan Madol started to outweigh the physical needs of the people. The saltwater eel, once a symbol of protection, may have eventually become a symbol of the Saudeleur's insatiable appetite for control. The mystery of Pohnpei remains etched into the basalt. Even today, local people approach certain areas of Nan Madol with a palpable sense of caution. The stories of the sacred eel have not entirely faded. They have simply moved into the realm of folklore, whispered in the evening shadows. The city may be silent, its canals choked with mangroves and its altars cold, but the memory of that ancient, watery connection persists. As the tide begins to pull away from the stones, revealing the slippery foundations of the islets, one can almost sense the presence of those old gods, still lingering in the brackish depths. The basalt columns stand like petrified sentinels, guarding the secrets of a time when a creature of the sea held the fate of an empire in its coils. We are left to wonder how much of our own history is shaped by the things we choose to worship, and how often we build our grandest monuments on the shifting sands of faith. And so the water continues its slow, rhythmic pulse, washing over the ruins of Pohnpei, erasing the blood of old sacrifices and the footprints of the priests. The city of the eel remains a place of deep time, where the past is not a distant memory, but a living, breathing shadow beneath the surface. In the silence of the Pacific, the mystery of the Saudeleur and their sacred medium endures, a testament to the power of the unseen in a world made of stone. The scent of rain often carries the weight of change before the first drop even touches the basalt, and in the final years of the Saudeleur's reign, the air over Nan Madol grew heavy with a stifling, predatory stillness. Power, when held too tightly for too long, has a tendency to sour, turning from a tool of order into a weapon of vanity. The later lords of the dynasty no longer saw themselves as stewards of the tides or mediators of the gods, but as the gods themselves, entitled to every breath drawn by the people of Pohnpei. The demands grew heavier with each passing season. The commoners were no longer merely asked for a portion of their harvest. They were stripped of their dignity, forced to provide tribute that bordered on the impossible, and subjected to whims that were as cruel as they were unpredictable. Legends whisper of a lord who demanded that the people bring him the tiniest of forest birds, not for food, but simply to watch them wither in cages, a display of his reach over even the most fragile of lives. The social fabric, once woven tight by shared ritual and the rhythmic construction of the stone city, began to fray at the edges, worn thin by the friction of tyranny. As the resentment simmered in the shadows of the great walls, a new figure began to materialize in the oral histories, a hero whose origins are as misty as the spray off the reef. His name was Isokellekel, and he was said to be a warrior of semi-divine lineage from the island of Khosrai, lying hundreds of miles to the east across the open, unforgiving blue of the Pacific. Some accounts suggest he was the son of the thunder god, sent to rectify the imbalance that had poisoned the heart of Nan Madol. He did not come alone. He arrived with a fleet of canoes carrying 333 warriors, a number that resonates through the ages like a rhythmic chant. They did not arrive as conquerors at first, but as visitors, drifting into the lagoon with a quiet purpose that masked their martial intent. They were welcomed into the city, perhaps because the reigning Saudeleur, blinded by his own perceived invincibility, could not imagine a threat coming from the very sea he claimed to command. For a time, Isokellekel and his men lived among the Pohnpeians, observing the layout of the artificial islands, noting the depth of the canals at low tide, and feeling the pulse of the people's discontent. They were like a slow-moving tide, encroaching so gradually that the change was imperceptible until the water was already at the doorstep. The tension eventually broke over a seemingly minor dispute involving a piece of fruit or a breach of protocol. The stories vary, but the result was an explosion of violence that had been centuries in the making. The battle for Nan Madol was not a single clash on an open field, but a harrowing, fragmented struggle through the labyrinth of the city. Imagine the sound of wooden clubs striking stone, the splashes of men falling into the dark canals, and the cries echoing off the high basalt prisms. The geography of the city, designed to protect the elite, became a trap. The very walls that were meant to keep the world out now hemmed the defenders in, turning the Venice of the Pacific into a claustrophobic theatre of war. The strategic genius of Isokellekel lay in his ability to turn the environment against the Tyrants. He understood that Nan Madol was a machine that required the constant input of resources from the main island to function. By severing the connection between the stone city and the fertile valleys of Pohnpei, he starved the elite of their power. The final Saudeleur, a man named Saumukoro, found himself retreating further into the architectural heart of his empire, watching as his influence evaporated like mist in the morning sun. The legend tells us that in his final moments of desperation, as the warriors of Khosrai breached the inner sanctums, the Lord did not fall to a blade. Instead, he transformed himself into a small fish and leaped into a stream, disappearing forever into the depths of the water he had once sought to rule. It is a poetic end, a suggestion that the tyranny did not truly die but merely dissolved back into the natural world, leaving the stone city empty and echoing. With the fall of the old regime, the atmosphere of the island shifted, yet the stones of Nan Madol remained, indifferent to the blood that had been spilled upon them. Isokellekel did not simply step into the shoes of the men he had overthrown. He recognized that the concentrated absolute power of the Saudeleur was a poison that would eventually kill any who drank too deeply of it, and so he initiated a profound transition in the way the island was governed, establishing the Nahnwarki system. This was a decentralized form of leadership where authority was shared among various districts, creating a balance of power that relied on mutual respect and complex social obligations rather than brute force and divine mandate. The title of Nahnwarki became one of high honor, but it was tempered by the needs of the community, a radical departure from the iron-fisted rule that had defined the previous centuries. Under this new system, the great stone city began to lose its central role as a seat of administrative power. The Nahnwarkis continued to live there for a time, but the spiritual weight of the place had changed. The ghosts of the Saudeleur seemed to linger in the damp corners of the Basalt Walls, and the sheer effort required to maintain the artificial islands began to feel more like a burden than a blessing. The focus of life started to drift back toward the main island, toward the soil and the forests, leaving Nan Madol to the priests, the spirits, and the encroaching mangroves. The transition was not a sudden abandonment, but a slow, rhythmic retreat, a long exhale after 1,000 years of holding one's breath. The city became a monument to a past that people wanted to remember, but no longer wished to inhabit. As the years passed, the canals began to silt up, and the roots of the trees found purchase in the cracks between the massive stones. The transition to the Nahnwarki system ensured the survival of the Pohnpeian culture, but it signaled the end of the era of megalithic expansion. No more great blocks were quarried from the distant cliffs. No more artificial islands were raised from the coral floor. The energy of the people was redirected toward the living world, leaving the city of stone to the slow, patient processes of decay and memory. In the quiet of the afternoon heat, one can almost feel the presence of Isokelekel, the warrior who broke the world so that it could be mended, standing on the edge of a basalt pier and watching as the first vines began their long green climb up the walls of the Tyrants. The mystery of why such a magnificent complex was ultimately left to the elements continues to haunt the modern imagination. Was it merely the difficulty of hauling fresh water and food to the site, or was there a deeper, more spiritual exhaustion that settled over the inhabitants? The archaeology of the transition period shows a gradual decline in the variety of artifacts found within the city, a thinning out of the daily detritus of life. Carbon dating of the topmost layers of soil on the platforms suggests that by the 17th and 18th centuries, the permanent population had dwindled to a handful of caretakers and ritual specialists. The city had become a necropolis, a place where the line between the living and the dead was as thin as the surface of the water at high tide. The ruins stood as a silent witness to the fact that even the most enduring monuments are subject to the shifting currents of human belief and the relentless passage of deep time. The rhythmic slap of the tide against the basalt foundations began to sound less like a heartbeat and more like a countdown. As the new rulers, the Nan Madol, established their authority over the ruins of the Saudeleur dynasty, they found themselves inheriting a masterpiece that was also a prison of logistical impossibility. The very features that made Nan Madol a marvel of the ancient world, its isolation upon the reef, its separation from the fertile soil of the main island, and its reliance on a complex web of tribute, became the very reasons for its slow, quiet surrender to the elements. The practicalities of daily life in a city of stone and salt were staggering to maintain. Every drop of fresh water, every taro root, and every bundle of firewood had to be ferried across the lagoon by outrigger canoe. While the Saudeleurs had commanded this labor through a system of divine fear and absolute fealty, the new era brought a shift in the social fabric. The energy required to sustain a sprawling urban center on a coral shelf began to feel like an unnecessary burden. It was a struggle against the fundamental laws of the landscape. As the years passed, the high chiefs found it increasingly sensible to reside on the mainland of Pohnpei, where the earth was soft, the springs were plentiful, and the shade of the breadfruit trees offered a respite that the sun-baked stones of the city could never provide. And so, the transition began, not with a sudden exodus or a violent upheaval, but with a gradual thinning of the pulse. One by one, the residential platforms were left to the wind, the cooking fires that had burned for centuries, sending thin ribbons of smoke into the Pacific sky, were allowed to go cold. The elaborate ceremonies that once filled the central courtyards became less frequent, then sporadic, and finally, they ceased altogether. Nan Madol was entering a period of deep, meditative silence, as if the stones themselves were exhaling after 1,000 years of bearing the weight of human ambition. Nature, ever patient and ever hungry, did not wait for the last human to depart before beginning its reclamation. The mangroves were the first to breach the perimeter. Their spindly, spider-like roots found purchase in the silt that gathered between the basalt logs, slowly prying apart the precision-laid walls. These trees, which thrive where the land meets the sea, began to weave a green shroud over the canals. What were once clear waterways, wide enough for royal processions, became choked with tangled wood and thick black mud. The salt-tolerant vines followed, trailing their heavy limbs over the high walls of Nandawas, their tiny tendrils seeking out every hairline fracture in the volcanic rock. There is a specific kind of stillness that descends upon a place when the jungle takes hold. It is a humid, heavy atmosphere where the air feels thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Under the canopy of the encroaching forest, the temperature dropped, and the bright glare of the ocean was replaced by a perpetual emerald twilight. The magnificent basalt structures, once stark and imposing against the blue horizon, began to blur at the edges. Ferns sprouted from the tops of the pillars, and mosses, soft as velvet and deep as the sea, carpeted the floors where kings had once walked. The city was no longer a capital. It was becoming a ruin, and in that transformation it acquired a new and formidable power. It became a forbidden place, a realm of ghosts and shadows known as the City of the Dead. To the people of Pohnpei, the abandonment was more than a change in residence. It was a spiritual quarantine. The memory of the Saudeleurs' cruelty and the strange supernatural origins of the stones created a boundary that few dared to cross. The ruins were left to the spirits, the Sosi, who were said to guard the empty chambers and the sunken tombs. Even the most daring fishermen would give the reef a wide berth after sunset, fearing the lights that were sometimes seen flickering among the mangroves, lights that had no human source. As the centuries rolled on, the jungle's grip tightened. Large trees grew directly out of the stone platforms, their roots wrapping around the massive basalt columns like the tentacles of some great subterranean beast. In some places, the weight of the vegetation and the constant pressure of the tides caused the walls to lean and eventually collapse into the water, creating a jumble of stone that looked more like a natural geological formation than a man-made structure. The stratigraphy, the layers of history buried beneath the surface, became a chaotic mix of organic debris and ancient artifacts. To a casual observer sailing past the reef in the 1800s, the city would have been nearly invisible, a mere thickening of the trees along the shoreline, its secrets hidden behind a wall of impenetrable green. This process of abandonment highlights a recurring theme in the study of lost civilizations: the fragility of the artificial in the face of the natural. Whether it is the sands of the Sahara burying the temples of the Nile, or the vines of the Pacific strangling the basalt of Nan Madol, the earth eventually seeks to reclaim its own. The logistical difficulty of maintaining a city on a reef was a physical manifestation of the distance the Saudeleur had placed between themselves and the natural world. Once that distance could no longer be bridged by forced labor and religious decree, the city was reclaimed by the very tides it had sought to defy. The transition from a living city to a forbidden ruin was complete. Nan Madol had become a ghost in the machine of the Pacific, a memory etched in stone and drowned in salt. It sat in a state of suspended animation, protected by its own desolation and the fearsome reputation that preceded it. The mangroves acted as a living fortress, guarding the entrance to a world that had forgotten the names of its builders. As the sun set over the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the drowned canals, the city seemed to sink deeper into the reef, waiting for a time when its silence would finally be broken by those seeking to understand the mysteries of the deep past. To the modern ear, the sound of water lapping against stone is a lullaby, a soft percussion that signals the meeting of the elements. But for the people of Pohnpei, this sound carries a different weight when it echoes through the narrow, vine-choked corridors of Nan Madol. They do not call it a tourist destination or an archaeological marvel. They call it the City of the Dead. It is a place where the barrier between the living world and the ancestral realm is said to be thin, porous as the volcanic rock itself, and the locals treat the site with a profound, quiet reverence that borders on genuine fear. Even today, as the 20th century gives way to the 21st, few Pohnpeians will venture into the ruins after the sun has dipped below the horizon, and fewer still would dare to spend a night among the basalt logs. The air here feels heavy, as if the very atmosphere is saturated with the memories of the Saudeleur lords and the thousands of souls who served them. There is a persistent belief that the city is not truly abandoned, but merely inhabited by those who no longer require the breath of life. Visitors and locals alike have reported the sight of strange, pale lights dancing over the darkened canals, spheres of soft luminescence that move with a deliberate, haunting intelligence. These are not the bioluminescence of the sea or the flickering of swamp gas, according to those who have seen them, but rather the Sumwen, the spirits of the ancient ones patrolling the tombs they built with such monumental effort. They are the silent guardians of a history that was never meant to be fully unearthed by the curious or the academic. Stories of the city's protective wrath are woven into the fabric of the island's oral tradition, serving as a warning to anyone who would treat the ruins with disrespect. One of the most famous accounts involves the German governor of the Marshall Islands, Victor Berg, who arrived at Nan Madol in the early 1900s. Driven by a desire to document and perhaps possess the secrets of the past, he ignored the pleas of the local people and insisted on excavating the tomb of a high priest. Legend says that as he disturbed the ancient remains, a violent thunderstorm broke out over the island, a sudden, unnatural tempest that seemed to scream from the sky itself. Governor Berg died the very next morning of a mysterious illness, his body failing him just hours after he had violated the sanctity of the stone. To the scientists of the time, it was perhaps a coincidence or a tropical fever, but to the people of Pohnpei, it was the inevitable consequence of disturbing those who had earned their eternal rest. As the years passed, these stories only grew in number, creating a cultural shield around the site that has perhaps done more to preserve Nan Madol than any modern conservation effort ever could. There is a sense of taboo that permeates the water and the stone. It is a quiet understanding that some places belong to the past, and that to claim them for the present is a form of spiritual theft. Even the most seasoned archaeologists, trained in the cold logic of stratigraphy and radiocarbon dating, the process of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic material, often find themselves speaking in hushed tones when they enter the central mortuary of Nan Katao. They feel the weight of the deep time that resides here, a chronological thickness that makes the modern world feel thin and fleeting. The caution shown by the Pohnpeians is not born of superstition in the way a Westerner might define it, but rather a sophisticated respect for the continuity of existence. In their view, the builders of Nan Madol did not simply vanish. They transitioned into a different state of being, and their city remains their sovereign territory. To walk through the ruins is to be a guest in a house where the hosts are invisible but ever present. This is why you will find no hotels built upon the reefs, no neon lights illuminating the basalt columns, and no bustling marketplaces within the canals. The silence is intentional. It is a gift of space given to the ancestors, a recognition that some mysteries are better left unprobed by the harsh light of modern inquiry. One might wonder what it is about these particular stones that commands such enduring dread. Perhaps it is the sheer scale of the labor involved, a physical manifestation of a power so absolute that it feels alien to our democratic sensibilities. Or perhaps it is the geometry of the place, the way the basalt prisms are stacked in interlocking patterns that seem to mimic the natural world while simultaneously defying it. As the twilight deepens, the shadows between the stones seem to lengthen and move, creating the illusion that the walls are breathing, expanding and contracting with the tide. It is in these moments, when the logic of the day begins to fray at the edges, that the stories of the Sumwen feel less like folklore and more like a fundamental truth of the landscape. Even the flora of the island seems to participate in this guardianship. The mangroves, with their tangled, spider-like roots, wrap around the foundations of the city, pulling the stones back into the earth as if trying to hide them from the gaze of the heavens. The vines drape over the doorways like heavy velvet curtains, ensuring that anyone who enters must do so with effort and humility. It is a place where nature and the supernatural have formed an alliance to protect the dignity of the fallen, and so the Venice of the Pacific remains a silent sentinel, a city of 92 artificial islands that refuses to be ruled by the living, standing as a testament to a time when men built monuments, not for the eyes of their peers, but for the approval of the spirits who dwell in the deep, dark places of the world. The scent of old salt and decaying mangrove leaves hung heavy in the air when the first sails of the west appeared on the horizon, white ghosts drifting toward a world they could not possibly understand. For centuries, the Saudeleur dynasty had been a memory whispered by the tides, and the basalt pillars of Nan Madol had belonged only to the crabs, the vines, and the spirits of the deep. But in the early 19th century, the isolation of Pohnpei began to fray as European explorers, whalers, and beachcombers stumbled upon the emerald shores of the Caroline Islands. They expected to find simple thatched huts and coral reefs, the familiar sights of the Pacific frontier. But instead, as they navigated their longboats through the narrow, silted channels of the eastern coast, they were met by a sight that defied every preconceived notion of the so-called primitive world. Imagine the silence on the deck of a wooden ship as it rounds the point of Temwen Island, only for the crew to see massive black walls rising directly out of the water, stacked like cordwood by the hands of giants. These were not the soft, organic shapes of the jungle, but the rigid, geometric lines of an engineered metropolis. The first Europeans to set eyes on these structures were profoundly shaken. The sheer scale of the basalt logs, some weighing many tons, seemed to suggest a level of organization and power that they believed was reserved only for the great empires of the Mediterranean or the East. They looked upon the ruins of Nan Duas, the great royal mortuary, and saw not just a tomb, but a fortress of the soul, standing defiant against the rhythmic pulse of the Pacific. Among these early witnesses was a man named James O'Connell, an Irish sailor who found himself shipwrecked on Pohnpei in the 1820s. O'Connell was a man of colourful stories and perhaps questionable motives, but his accounts provide some of the earliest, most vivid descriptions of the ruins as they appeared before the heavy hands of modern archaeology began to stir the dust. He spoke of the Venice of the Pacific with a mixture of awe and genuine confusion, sketching the outlines of a city that seemed to be drowning in its own history. His drawings, though rudimentary, captured the impossible geometry of the place, the way the basalt columns were laid in alternating headers and stretchers, a technique that provided both stability and a haunting rhythmic beauty to the walls. O'Connell noted that the local people treated the ruins with a profound, quiet reverence, steering their canoes wide of certain channels and speaking of the city in hushed tones, as if the stones themselves were still listening for the commands of their ancient masters. As these reports filtered back to the salons of Europe and the libraries of America, a strange and intoxicating fever began to take hold of the Western imagination. The discovery of Nan Madol coincided with a growing fascination for lost continents and sunken empires. If such a massive stone city existed in the middle of a vast ocean, thousands of miles from any known center of ancient civilization, then where had its builders come from? The scientific community of the time struggled to reconcile the existence of Nan Madol with their linear theories of human progress. To many, it seemed impossible that a small island population could have quarried, transported, and stacked millions of pounds of volcanic rock without the aid of metal tools or complex machinery. And so, the shadows of the ruins gave birth to the legend of Mu. Theorists like James Churchward began to propose that Nan Madol was not a local creation, but a surviving fragment of a much larger landmass, a lost continent that had once spanned the Pacific before being swallowed by the sea in a prehistoric cataclysm. They pointed to the submerged walls and the way the city seemed to march directly into the deep water as evidence that the builders were working on a different coastline, one that had since been reshaped by the rising tides of the Younger Dryas, that period of abrupt climate change and rising sea levels roughly 12,000 years ago. While modern geology tells a story of volcanic subsidence and gradual sea level rise, the idea of Mu offered a romantic, tragic explanation for the silence of the stones. It turned Nan Madol into a gateway to a forgotten epoch, a place where the survivors of a global disaster had tried to rebuild their world one basalt log at a time. Meanwhile, the first serious attempts to map the complex canal system began to reveal the true architectural genius of the site. Explorers and early cartographers spent weeks wading through knee-deep water and thick silt, trying to trace the outlines of the 92 artificial islands. They found that the city was not merely a collection of buildings, but a living machine designed to manage the flow of the tides. The canals were not just streets, they were arteries that brought the life-giving ocean into the heart of the city, while flushing out the waste of a royal population. The mapping process was a slow, grueling labor, hindered by the relentless growth of the mangroves and the sweltering heat of the tropics. Every time a new wall was cleared of vines, another mystery emerged. A hidden doorway leading to an underground chamber, or a ceremonial pool, where sacred eels were said to have been fed the entrails of sacrificed turtles. The early documentarians were struck by the precision of the layout. Despite being built on a foundation of coral rubble and sand, the islands had remained remarkably stable for centuries. The surveyors began to realize that the builders had a deep understanding of hydrodynamics and structural engineering. They had placed the largest, heaviest stones at the corners of the islands to act as breakwaters, shielding the inner structures from the erosive power of the waves. It was a city built in harmony with the ocean, yet designed to withstand its fury. As the maps grew more detailed, the sheer scale of the undertaking became clear. The volume of stone moved to create Nan Madol was comparable to the Great Pyramids of Egypt, yet it was accomplished on a remote island with a fraction of the population. As the 19th century drew to a close, the documentation of Nan Madol became a race against time and the elements. The stone city was a puzzle that refused to be solved, a place where every answer only led to more profound questions about the limits of human capability and the depths of time. The explorers who walked these canals felt the weight of forgotten ages pressing down upon them, a sense that they were trespassing in a realm that did not belong to the present. They saw the basalt columns weathered by the salt air but still standing firm, and they wondered how many other cities lay beneath the waves, waiting for the tides to turn. The early Western encounters did not demystify Nan Madol. Instead, they draped it in a new layer of myth, transforming it from a local ruin into a global enigma, a silent sentinel at the edge of the world, guarding the secrets of a civilization that had mastered the art of building for eternity. Beneath the heavy, humid silence of the Pohnpeian canopy, the modern world has attempted to peel back the layers of moss and myth with the cold precision of instruments. For decades, the stones of Nan Madol remained silent to the questions of Western science, but eventually the earth began to yield its chronologies. Archaeologists, moving with a slow and rhythmic patience that mirrors the tides, turned to the very foundations of the city to understand its birth. By employing radiocarbon dating, a process that measures the steady decay of carbon atoms within organic matter, researchers began to analyze the ancient coral used as fill between the massive basalt logs. These tiny fragments of reef, once living organisms, hold within them a chemical clock that stops the moment they are pulled from the sea. The results whisper of a timeline that stretches much further back than many had dared to imagine, suggesting that the earliest construction on these artificial islets may have commenced as early as the 8th or 9th century. By the year 1200, the Saudeleur dynasty was already well entrenched, orchestrating a feat of engineering that defies the simple logic of a prehistoric society. As the years passed, the focus shifted from the age of the stones to the sheer, impossible weight of them. Each of the thousands of basalt columns that form the walls of Nan Madol is a natural volcanic prism, formed by the cooling of lava into hexagonal and pentagonal shapes. Yet these geological wonders did not originate on the eastern shore where the city now sits. They were quarried from various locations across the island of Pohnpei, some from the opposite side of the mountainous interior. We are left to contemplate the logistics of moving stones that weigh as much as 50 tons across a landscape of jagged volcanic peaks and dense, tangled mangroves. There are no records of the wheel here, no beasts of burden to pull the weight through the mud. The local oral histories speak of the sorcerers, Olosohpa and Olosihpa, using their divine powers to make the stones fly through the air like birds, landing softly in their designated spots. In the absence of a mechanical explanation that satisfies the laws of physics, the image of those levitating stones lingers in the mind, a poetic placeholder for a lost technology or a collective strength we can no longer fathom. Modern science, however, continues its search for a more terrestrial answer. Some researchers suggest the use of massive rafts made from the buoyant trunks of local trees, timed meticulously with the rising tides to float the basalt around the coastline. But even this theory falters when one considers the precision required to stack these columns into the intricate criss-cross patterns of the walls, reaching heights of 30 feet. The effort represents millions of man-hours, a staggering investment of energy for a population living on a remote Pacific island. This leads to a persistent debate among scholars regarding the total number of people the city and its surrounding lands could actually support. Some estimates suggest a peak population of perhaps 25,000 souls, a density that would have required a highly sophisticated system of agriculture and resource management. Others argue that Nan Madol was never a city for the masses, but rather a ritualistic precinct, a silent, stony Vatican of the Pacific, where only the elite and their servants resided, supported by the labor and tribute of the entire island. The mystery deepened in recent years with the arrival of LiDAR technology, a method of light detection and ranging that uses laser pulses from aircraft to peer through the thickest vegetation. For centuries, the jungle had reclaimed much of the land surrounding the stone city, hiding the true extent of the civilization beneath a deceptive green shroud. When the first LiDAR maps were processed, they revealed something startling. A vast hidden landscape of irrigation channels, residential platforms, and agricultural terraces that extended far beyond the visible ruins of the islets. The city was not an isolated fortress, but the heart of a sprawling, interconnected megalopolis that had been swallowed by the forest. These hidden structures suggest a level of urban planning that rivals the great cities of the ancient world, a complex network of water management that allowed the Saudeleur to exert their will over the very environment. As we look at these digital ghosts of a vanished society, we are reminded of the limits of our own understanding. We can date the coral and map the foundations, but we cannot truly hear the voices of those who walked these stone corridors. We are left with the stratigraphy of the island, the study of its layers of soil and debris, which tells a story of rise and fall, of a civilization that reached a pinnacle of architectural daring before slowly fading into the shadows of history. The transition from the Saudeleur period to the subsequent Isokelekele era is marked by a shift in the archaeological record, a subtle change in the types of pottery and tools found in the silt. It is a reminder that even the most enduring monuments are subject to the whims of time and the inevitable decay of human systems. There is a certain melancholy in the way the basalt columns lean into the sea, weathered by 1,000 years of salt spray. The science of archaeology provides us with the when and the how, but the why remains elusive, drifting just out of reach like a piece of driftwood on the tide. Why build so much, so high, and on the water's edge, where the foundations would be forever challenged by the rising ocean? Perhaps it was a statement of defiance against the gods, or a way to live in harmony with the spirits of the deep. Some proponents of alternative history point to the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate change and rising sea levels over 10,000 years ago, suggesting that Nan Madol might be built upon the ruins of something even older, a remnant of a lost Pacific continent that was submerged as the glaciers melted. While mainstream science finds no evidence for such an extreme antiquity, the sheer scale of the ruins invites such speculation. It feels too grand, too deliberate to be the work of a small, isolated community. And so, we stand at the intersection of data and dreams. The LiDAR scans show us the bones of the city, but the spirit of Nan Madol remains locked within the heavy basalt. We see the canals that once hummed with the movement of outrigger canoes, now choked with silt and mangroves. We see the massive tombs where the kings were laid to rest, their bones long since vanished into the humid air. Every new discovery seems to raise two new questions for every one it answers. As the modern world continues to probe the site with drones and satellites, the city seems to withdraw further into its own silence, a sentinel of a deep time that we are only beginning to comprehend. The stones remain, heavy and indifferent to our curiosity, guarding a history that was written in the language of the earth and the sea, a language we have forgotten how to speak, but one that we can still feel in the cool, damp shadows of the Venice of the Pacific. To look at the globe is to see a vast blue canvas where the Pacific Ocean stretches out as an almost infinite void, punctuated only by the smallest specks of emerald and basalt. In the grand hierarchy of ancient stone, we often find our minds drifting toward the stoic faces of Easter Island, the moai that stare eternally inland from their coastal platforms. We think of the trilithons of Tonga or the latte stones of the Marianas. Yet, Nan Madol exists in a category of its own, a singular expression of maritime urban planning that has no true parallel in the human story. While other cultures built upward toward the heavens or carved deep into the mountains, the people of Pohnpei built outward over the water, claiming the very tides as their foundation. This was not merely a collection of monuments, it was a functioning city of 92 artificial islands, a Venice of the Pacific that thrived long before the first stone of the great cathedrals of Europe was even quarried. The uniqueness of this place lies in its defiance of the elements. On Easter Island, the mystery is one of transport across rolling hills and grassy plains. At Nan Madol, the mystery is one of buoyancy and the brutal weight of the sea. The architects here did not have the luxury of solid ground. They worked with the rhythm of the moon, timing their labor with the ebb and flow of the Pacific, weaving massive prismatic basalt columns into a lattice that could withstand the constant pressure of the waves. It is a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, where the canals were not just for travel, but served as the veins and arteries of a living, breathing social organism. When we compare it to the great ruins of the world, we see that Nan Madol is perhaps the most fragile of them all, a heavy lithic dream resting upon a shifting, living reef. As the years passed and the modern world began to take measure of these ruins, the international community realized that Nan Madol was not just a local treasure, but a vital chapter in the history of our species. In the year 2016, it was officially designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a title that brought with it both prestige and a profound sense of urgency. To name it a World Heritage Site was to acknowledge that if these stones were to slip into the sea, a piece of the human soul would go with them. But the designation also highlighted the precarious nature of its existence. Unlike the dry sands of Egypt that preserve the past in a desiccated embrace, the environment of Pohnpei is one of relentless growth and decay. The humidity is a constant weight, and the salt air acts as a slow, invisible sandpaper, wearing down the edges of the history we are trying so desperately to read. The challenges of preservation here are as immense as the stones themselves. We are dealing with a site built on a foundation that is fundamentally alive. The coral reef beneath the city is a biological entity, subject to the warming of the oceans and the rising of the tides. As the sea levels creep upward, the very canals that once hummed with the sound of outrigger canoes are becoming deeper, more turbulent. The mangroves, with their tangled, spider-like roots, are both a blessing and a curse. While they protect the islands from the direct battering of the storm surges, their roots also snake into the crevices of the basalt walls, prying the stones apart with a slow, vegetable strength that no mortar could ever hope to resist. To save Nan Madol is to engage in a quiet war against the passage of time and the indomitable power of the tropical forest. Archaeologists today use sophisticated tools to map this struggle, employing techniques like stratigraphy, the study of soil layers to determine the chronological sequence of events, to understand how the city evolved over the centuries. They look at the radiocarbon dating of charcoal found deep within the foundations, trying to pin down the exact moment when the first basalt log was lowered into the water. But even with our most advanced sensors, the site remains elusive. The shifting silt of the lagoon hides as much as it reveals, burying the discarded remnants of daily life under meters of muck and coral debris. We find ourselves looking at a puzzle where the pieces are constantly moving, where the ground beneath our feet is a labyrinth of submerged history that may never be fully mapped. And so, we are forced to wonder about the long-term fate of this maritime capital. In the context of deep time, the rise and fall of civilizations are but brief flickers in the dark. We see the traces of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate cooling that occurred roughly 12,900 years ago, and we realize how sensitive our ancestors were to the whims of the planet. Nan Madol is a more recent story, yet it faces a similar existential threat. It is a city caught between two worlds, the world of the land and the world of the deep. It was born from the sea, and the sea seems intent on reclaiming it, one stone at a time. The preservationists work in the shadows of the great walls, clearing away the vines and documenting the tilt of every megalith, but there is a sense that they are merely slowing an inevitable return to the silence of the reef. There is a certain melancholy in this realization, a feeling that we are witnesses to a slow-motion vanishing act. But perhaps that is part of the city's power. Its beauty is not found in its permanence, but in its defiance. It stands as a testament to a time when humans did not seek to conquer nature, but to inhabit its most difficult spaces, to build a throne upon the waves. When we compare it to the stone circles of Europe or the pyramids of the Americas, we see a different philosophy of existence, one that accepted the fluidity of the world and built accordingly. The stones of Nan Madol do not scream for attention. They hum with the low frequency of the tides, waiting for the next cycle of history to wash over them. As we move through the canals in our imagination, passing under the leaning shadows of the high walls, we feel the weight of those who came before. They were people who understood the stars and the currents, who moved through this water world with a grace we can scarcely imagine. They left behind a blueprint of a life lived in harmony with the ocean, a blueprint that is now being slowly erased by the very water that once sustained it. The global significance of Nan Madol is not just in its size or its mystery, but in its role as a mirror. It reflects our own fragility back at us, reminding us that even the most solid foundations are subject to the slow, patient erosion of the ages. And yet, the silence of the city is not a void. It is a presence. It is the sound of the wind through the palm fronds and the lap of the water against the basalt. It is the feeling of being in a place where the barrier between the past and the present has grown thin. As the modern world continues its frantic pace, Nan Madol remains a sanctuary of stillness, a place where deep time is not an abstract concept, but something you can touch with your hand. The stones are cool, damp, and heavy with the secrets of 1,000 years. They do not care for our titles or our designations. They simply are. In the grand tapestry of human achievement, this city is a thread of dark, iridescent silk, woven into the blue expanse of the Pacific. It challenges our definitions of urban life and forces us to reconsider what is possible when human will meet the raw materials of the earth. As we contemplate the challenges of its preservation, we must also contemplate our own place in the sequence of centuries. We are the temporary guardians of a legacy that began long before us and will, in some form, continue long after we are gone. Whether the city remains above the waves or eventually sinks into the embrace of the coral, its story is now part of us, a haunting melody played on the strings of the sea, a memory of a time when we dared to build a city where no city should be. The Venice of the Pacific continues to watch the horizon, a sentinel of the deep waiting for the tide to turn once more. The salt, heavy air carries a scent that is both ancient and immediate, a mixture of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp tang of the Pacific spray. It is a scent that speaks of a city in a constant state of flux, caught in a slow-motion struggle between the solid basalt of the past and the fluid uncertainty of the future. While the legends speak of ghosts and the spirits of the Saudeleur, there is a very real, very physical spectre haunting these canals today, the relentless rise of the ocean itself. For centuries the levels of the sea remained relatively stable, allowing the stone foundations to rest securely upon the coral reef. But as the global climate shifts, the very element that gave Nan Madol its life is now threatening to reclaim it entirely. The tides are no longer just visitors to the palace floors, they are becoming permanent residents. On days when the moon pulls most strongly at the earth's waters, the canals overflow their ancient boundaries, submerging the walkways and seeping into the crevices of the great walls. This rising water brings with it more than just moisture. It brings the patient, erosive power of the deep. As the water levels climb, the salt begins to crystallize within the pores of the basalt, a process that, over many decades, can cause even the sturdiest stone to flake and crumble. We are witnessing a quiet aquatic siege, where the enemy does not strike with iron or fire, but with the soft, repetitive rhythm of the waves. In this shifting landscape, the vegetation has become a complex and contradictory force. The mangroves, with their tangled, spider-like roots, have marched inward from the sea, colonizing the edges of the islets and weaving themselves into the very fabric of the city. To the casual observer, they might seem like a threat, their thick roots prying apart the carefully placed stones, their heavy canopies hiding the magnificent architecture from the sun. And in many ways, they are. The sheer weight of the overgrowth puts immense pressure on the structures, and as the trees grow, their roots can act like slow-motion levers, toppling walls that have stood for nearly 1,000 years. Yet, in a strange irony of nature, these same mangroves serve as a final line of defense. Their dense networks of roots act as a natural breakwater, absorbing the energy of the storm surges and protecting the inner city from the full fury of the Pacific. Without them, the rising tides and the increasingly violent tropical storms might have already washed away the smaller, more delicate platforms. The city is held in a precarious embrace, a grip that both sustains it against the sea and slowly crushes it under the weight of the forest. It is a delicate living tension that defines the modern existence of Nan Madol, a balance between the organic and the eternal. The international community has begun to take notice of this silent crisis, recognizing that Nan Madol is not just a treasure for the people of Pohnpei, but a piece of the human story that belongs to the world. Conservationists and archaeologists from across the globe have joined forces with local guardians to map the most at-risk islets, using modern technology to understand how the water is moving through the complex network of canals. They employ laser scanning and satellite imagery to track the subtle shifts in the stone, identifying where the foundations are sinking and where the walls are beginning to lean. These efforts are not about restoring the city to a pristine, imagined past, but about stabilizing what remains so that it might survive another century. It is a monumental task, requiring a gentle touch and a deep respect for the original builders. Workers carefully remove the most invasive vegetation, clearing the silt from the canals to allow the water to flow as it once did, preventing the stagnant pools that accelerate the decay of the stone. They work with the rhythm of the tides, often standing waist-deep in the water, to reposition a fallen pillar or to reinforce a crumbling corner, with traditional methods that mirror the techniques of the ancient masons. Amidst these preservation efforts, a new challenge has emerged, the delicate dance between sharing this wonder with the world and protecting it from the very people who come to admire it. Tourism brings a renewed interest and much-needed resources to the site, yet the footfalls of thousands can be as damaging as the rising tides. Every visitor who walks across the basalt platforms leaves a microscopic trace of wear, and the vibration of modern life can disturb the silence that has settled over the ruins for centuries. The local authorities face a difficult choice: how to open the gates of this water-bound labyrinth without losing the mystery and the sanctity that make it so special. They have opted for a path of restraint, encouraging a form of travel that is slow and contemplative, much like the city itself. There are no grand hotels or neon lights here. Instead, there is the quiet splash of a paddle in the water and the soft rustle of the palms. The goal is to ensure that Nan Madol remains a place of pilgrimage rather than a mere spectacle, a place where the visitor can feel the weight of deep time and the fragility of our own creations. As we look upon the walls of Nandawas, the royal mortuary, we see the moss creeping over the grey stone and the water lapping at the stairs, and we are reminded that history is not a static thing recorded in books. It is a living, breathing entity that is constantly being reshaped by the elements. The rising tides are a reminder that our world is changing, and that even the most formidable fortresses are subject to the whims of the earth. Nan Madol stands as a sentinel, a silent witness to the rise and fall of empires, and now a barometer for the health of our planet. The questions that linger in the air are as thick as the evening mist. How much longer can these stones withstand the salt and the spray? Will future generations be able to navigate these canals, or will they only be able to view the city through the distorted lens of the water, looking down at a sunken kingdom? There is a profound sadness
in the thought of such a place disappearing, yet there is also a sense of inevitability. The sea gave, and the sea is taking back. But for now, the city remains. It endures in the quiet moments between the tides, when the water is still and the reflections of the basalt pillars stretch deep into the dark lagoons. In these moments, the boundary between the past and the present seems to dissolve, and we can almost hear the echoes of the drums and the chanting of the priests. The international efforts to stabilize the ruins are a testament to our desire to hold onto our heritage, to preserve the evidence of our ingenuity and our ambition against the encroaching darkness. As the years pass, the work continues, a slow, patient labor of love that matches the pace of the city itself. Every stone stabilized, every canal cleared, is a victory against the tide. It is a way of saying that even in the face of overwhelming change, some things are worth saving. Nan Madol teaches us about the limits of human power, but it also teaches us about the resilience of the human spirit, our drive to build, to create, and to remember. The Venice of the Pacific is currently caught in a transition, a long twilight where the ancient world meets the modern crisis. It is a place where the environmental and the historical are inextricably linked, where the health of the coral reef is just as important as the stability of the stone walls. As we move forward into an uncertain future, the story of Nan Madol serves as both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder that we are all, in a sense, building on shifting sands, and that our greatest legacy may not be the monuments we leave behind, but the care we take in preserving the wonders of those who came before us.
The sound of the Pacific tide rushing through the narrow channels of Nan Madol is a sound that has not changed in 1,000 years, a rhythmic, liquid pulse that serves as the heartbeat of Pohnpeian identity. Even now, as the basalt columns sit heavy and silent in the salt spray, the city is far from dead. It lives in the way a modern Pohnpeian carries themselves, in the quiet respect shown to the ruins, and in the deep-seated understanding that their ancestors achieved the impossible. For the people of this island, Nan Madol is not merely a collection of archaeological sites to be mapped and measured. It is a foundational stone of their very being, a physical manifestation of a lineage that stretches back into the misty dawn of the Pacific. To look upon these walls is to see the reflection of a people who mastered the sea and the stone, who understood the intricate balance between the physical world and the spiritual forces that govern it. The city stands as a constant, silent teacher, reminding each new generation that they are the heirs to a legacy of profound ambition and unparalleled engineering. As the years passed and the jungle began its slow green reclamation of the islets, the physical structures remained as a testament to a level of sophistication that challenges our modern assumptions about ancient societies. We often think of progress as a linear climb, yet here, in the middle of the vast blue expanse of the ocean, a civilization flourished that managed logistics we would struggle to replicate today without heavy machinery. The sheer scale of the basalt transport, moving thousands of tons of rock across miles of reef and water, speaks to a society organized by a singular, powerful vision. It was a vision that saw the ocean not as a barrier, but as a highway, and the volcanic rock not as a burden, but as the fabric of a sacred geometry. This ambition was not born of necessity alone, but of a desire to touch the divine, to create a space where the veil between the worlds was thin enough to hear the whispers of the gods. The engineering of Nan Madol is a language written in stone, a complex syntax of weight and counterweight that has endured the relentless battering of tropical storms and the slow erosion of time. And so, the oral traditions of Pohnpei have become the true guardians of the city's secrets, flowing through the centuries like the water in the canals. While the stones are silent, The stories are vibrant and alive, passed from elder to youth in the quiet hours of the evening. These narratives, rich with the exploits of the Saudeleur and the eventual liberation brought by Olosohpa, provide a map of the Pohnpeian soul. They are not merely myths or legends in the Western sense, but a living history that informs the present. The power of these traditions lies in their ability to preserve the emotional and spiritual truth of Nan Madol, even when the specific dates and names might blur in the long shadows of deep time. The oral record maintains the warnings against hubris and the reminders of the sacred protocols that must be observed when walking among the ruins. It is through these spoken words that the city continues to exert its influence, ensuring that the respect for the site remains as firm as the basalt foundations themselves. The stories act as a bridge, connecting the modern Pohnpeian to a past that is both glorious and haunting, a past that refuses to be forgotten. Meanwhile, the silence that now blankets the islets of Nan Madol invites a deeper reflection on the inevitable cycles of human history. To walk through the abandoned central mortuary of Nandawaz is to witness the final stage of a great empire's journey, the transition from a bustling center of power to a sanctuary of stillness. Every great civilization seems to follow this rhythmic pattern of rise, peak, and eventual quietude. The Saudeleur dynasty, for all its terrifying authority and architectural brilliance, eventually gave way to a new order, leaving behind only the echoing chambers of their stone city. It is a sobering thought, one that reminds us of the fragility of even the most massive monuments. The silence here is not empty. It is heavy with the weight of forgotten names and the ghosts of ceremonies long since concluded. It is a silence that speaks of the limits of human control and the ultimate authority of nature, which eventually claims all things back into its fold. As we consider the legacy of this Venice of the Pacific, we are forced to confront the gaps in our own understanding of the ancient world. We use tools like radiocarbon dating to pin down the centuries, and stratigraphy, the study of soil layers, to understand the sequence of construction. But these methods can only tell us the when and the how of the stones. They cannot capture the why, the internal fire that drove a people to build a city on a reef, the fear that the Saudeleurs inspired, or the relief that must have washed over the islands when the old regime finally fell. The mystery of Nan Madol remains its most enduring quality, a puzzle that resists a complete solution. It stands as a monument to the unknown, a place where the evidence of the past is clear to the eye, yet the true essence of the civilization remains just out of reach, hidden behind the moss and the mangrove roots. The city serves as a mirror for our own era, reflecting back the transience of power and the permanence of art and spirit. In the grand scale of deep time, the centuries of the Saudeleur reign are but a heartbeat, yet the physical presence of their ambition remains an indelible mark on the planet. This cycle of building and abandoning, of speaking and falling silent, is the story of humanity itself. Nan Madol is a reminder that we are all temporary residents in the structures we build, and that eventually the jungle or the sea will come to claim its due. Yet there is a beauty in this cycle, a poetic grace in the way the stone walls have integrated with the natural environment, becoming a home for the fish and the birds, a sanctuary where the man-made and the natural are no longer distinct entities. The city has returned to the elements, but in doing so, it has achieved a kind of immortality that no living king could ever possess. In the quiet corners of the reefs, where the water is clear and the sun filters through the palms, one can almost feel the presence of the thousands who once called this place home. Their laughter, their prayers, and their toil are woven into the very atmosphere of the islets. The legacy of Nan Madol is not just in the stones, but in the enduring mystery of the human spirit's desire to leave a mark upon the world. It is a story of defiance against the elements and a celebration of the ingenuity that defines our species. As the tide continues its eternal ebb and flow through the ancient canals, the city remains a sentinel of the Pacific, watching over the islands and waiting for the next chapter in the long, winding history of the people of Pohnpei. The stones will remain, the stories will be told, and the silence will continue to hold the secrets of the Venice of the Pacific, a place that no one truly dares to rule, for it belongs now to the ages. The wind has a specific way of moving through the gaps in the basalt, a low melodic hum that sounds less like a breeze and more like a collective intake of breath from 1,000 lungs. It is a sound that has not changed in over 700 years, vibrating against the hexagonal surfaces of the volcanic rock, with a consistency that makes the present moment feel fragile and thin. If you were to stand upon the central platform of Nandawas right now, you would feel that vibration in the soles of your feet, a subtle reminder that these stones were not merely stacked, but orchestrated to harmonize with the elements of the Pacific. As the light begins to change, shifting from the harsh clarity of the afternoon into a soft, honeyed amber, the shadows of the great walls stretch across the dark water of the canals. The deep greys of the basalt take on a purple hue, and the moss that clings to the lower tiers seems to glow with a vibrant emerald intensity. There is no urgency here, only the slow rhythmic pulse of the tide as it pushes against the foundations of the 92 artificial islets. The water is a dark mirror now, reflecting the jagged silhouettes of the megaliths and the overhanging canopy of the mangroves, blurring the line between the natural world and the monumental architecture of the Saudeleur. It is in this light that the city truly reveals its character, not as a ruin to be studied, but as a living monument to the concept of permanence in a world defined by its ephemerality. The sheer weight of the history here is palpable, measured in the millions of tons of stone that were transported across the island without the aid of wheels, pulleys, or beasts of burden. We speak of the younger Dryas and the shifts in global climate that have reshaped our coastlines over thousands of years, yet here, amidst the salt spray and the humidity, the stratigraphy of human ambition remains visible to the naked eye. Each layer of stone represents a choice, a prayer, or perhaps a command issued by a ruler whose name has been lost to the winds, but whose legacy is written in the very crust of the earth. And so, we find ourselves contemplating the silence that has settled over the Venice of the Pacific. It is not the silence of a graveyard, but rather the quiet of a house whose inhabitants have stepped out for a moment and have simply forgotten to return. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and salt, a grounding aroma that anchors the wandering mind to the physical reality of the site. You can almost hear the ghostly echoes of the conch shells that once signaled the start of a royal ceremony, or the rhythmic splashing of paddles as high-ranking priests navigated the narrow waterways in their outrigger canoes. These sounds are gone, replaced by the rustle of palm fronds and the occasional cry of a seabird. Yet the architecture remains as a defiant testament to what a society can achieve when it aligns its will with the bones of the island itself. As the sun dips lower, touching the horizon and spilling a trail of liquid gold across the surface of the ocean, the basalt columns seem to grow taller, their edges sharpening against the deepening blue of the sky. The engineering of Nan Madol is such that even in its state of decay, it commands a profound respect, a recognition that the people who built this place understood something about the relationship between stone and sea that we are only beginning to rediscover. They worked with the natural geometry of the basalt, utilizing the way the lava cooled into perfect prisms millions of years ago, long before the first human foot touched the soil of Pohnpei. This is deep time manifesting in the palm of your hand, the intersection of geological history and human creativity. The permanence of the stone stands in stark contrast to the transience of the men who moved them. We are, by our very nature, creatures of a brief season, flickering like fireflies against the backdrop of the ages. The Saudeleur dynasty rose, flourished, and fell, leaving behind stories of cruelty and brilliance, of divine right and eventual rebellion. Their names are whispered in the oral traditions of the Pohnpei people, served as warnings or as foundations for the modern clans, but the stones do not care for the politics of men. They remain indifferent to the rise and fall of empires, the shifts in religious thought, or the arrival of carbon dating and archaeological surveys. The basalt simply is, holding its position against the encroaching tides and the relentless growth of the jungle. Meanwhile, the stars begin to emerge in the overhead canopy of the night, mirroring the scattered islets of the city below. In this darkness, the boundaries of Nan Madol seem to expand, stretching out into the lagoon until the entire coast feels like part of the complex. It is easy to understand why the locals speak of the city with a sense of guarded reverence, why they are hesitant to linger here after the light has faded. There is a weight to the air, a feeling of being watched by the very landscape itself. It is a place that belongs to the spirits now, or perhaps to the ancestors who poured their life force into the construction of these walls. To rule here would be an act of vanity, for how can one claim dominion over a city that has outlasted every king who ever sought to command it? As the last of the light vanishes, leaving only the silver glow of the moon to illuminate the basalt columns, a profound sense of peace settles over the ruins. The water in the canals is still, save for the occasional ripple of a fish or the slow movement of a drifting leaf. The heat of the day has dissipated, replaced by a cool, freshening breeze that carries the tang of the deep ocean. In this stillness, the mysteries of Nan Madol do not feel like puzzles to be solved, but like truths to be accepted. We may never know the exact methods of transport, or the specific rituals performed in the inner sanctums of the temples, and perhaps that is as it should be. Some secrets are meant to be kept by the stone, protected by the isolation of the Pacific and the passing of the centuries. The city remains a sentinel, a silent witness to the endurance of the human spirit and the inescapable power of the natural world. As the years pass and the tides continue their eternal cycle of ebb and flow, the Venice of the Pacific will continue to stand, its basalt walls weathered but unbroken. It is a place of profound beauty and chilling isolation, a monument to a civilization that reached for the divine and left its fingerprints on the very bedrock of the earth. We leave it now to the darkness and the stars, stepping back from the edge of the ancient world and returning to the flow of our own time, carrying with us the memory of the stones and the heavy, resonant silence of a place that no one truly dares to rule. The journey through these canals is more than a trip through space. It is a descent into the depths of our shared heritage, a reminder that beneath the surface of our modern lives, the foundations of the past are always present, solid and unyielding. The basalt columns will be there when the sun rises again, and they will be there long after the names of our own cities have faded into the mists of legend. For now, let the wind hum through the gaps in the rock, and let the water wash over the ancient steps, for the city of Nan Madol is at rest, cradled by the sea and the secrets of the ages.